The Los Angeles airport thrummed with its usual chaos. Luggage wheels rattled against the glossy floors. Hurried footsteps echoed down wide corridors, and voices overlapped in an orchestra of urgency. Overhead, announcements about boarding gates and delayed flights cut through the noise, adding to the city's relentless rhythm. Amid the hustle, Keanu Reeves stood quietly in the first-class line, an island of calm in the midst of the airport's storm. Dressed simply in a plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed boots, Keanu carried a well-worn backpack slung over one shoulder. There was nothing flashy about him, no designer luggage, no polished exterior to command attention. To most passers-by, he looked like any other traveler, perhaps one trying to save on baggage fees. But for anyone who took a moment to truly look, there was something unmistakably different about him. It wasn't in his clothes or his belongings, but in his presence, a kind of grounded stillness that felt out of place in the frenzied atmosphere. Keanu didn't seem rushed or anxious like the travelers around him. He stood with an air of quiet assurance, his gaze moving slowly over his surroundings, as if observing every detail and appreciating the moment for what it was. It wasn't arrogance, nor was it indifference. It was the kind of calm that comes from someone who had long ago made peace with the chaos of the world. Directly behind him in line, Victor Harding stood in stark contrast, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit and Italian leather shoes that gleamed under the airport's fluorescent lights. Victor exuded a confidence that bordered on self-importance. His cologne lingered in the air, bold and unapologetic. Much like the man himself, every movement he made was deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he were constantly performing for an invisible audience that he believed deserved his best. Victor's gaze swept over the first-class line with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing his surroundings. When his eyes landed on Keanu, his lips curled into a subtle smirk, the kind of smile that held more judgment than amusement. "First class, huh?" Victor said, his voice cutting through the hum of the terminal. The tone was light, but carried an undercurrent of mockery. "You never know who might show up here these days." Keanu turned slightly at the sound, meeting Victor's gaze with a calm and measured expression. There was no trace of annoyance or defensiveness in his demeanor, only quiet curiosity. "The world is full of surprises," he replied simply, his voice even and unshaken. Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting a different reaction. He seemed momentarily thrown off by Keanu's lack of response, a man who didn't flinch under judgment or feel the need to justify his place in line. Victor waited for more, perhaps a hint of defensiveness or a sign of embarrassment. But Keanu simply turned back to face the counter as if the comment hadn't mattered at all. Victor shifted on his polished heels, his smirk fading into something closer to confusion. He wasn't used to being ignored, much less by someone who, in his eyes, didn't belong in first class. The sharp lines of his suit and the gleam of his Rolex were, to him, a symbol of status, a declaration that he had earned his place here. Keanu's unassuming appearance, by comparison, felt like an intrusion, an anomaly in a space Victor believed was reserved for people like him. The line began to move forward, and as Keanu stepped ahead, his pace remained unhurried, almost leisurely. Victor followed with his usual confident stride, though he couldn't help but glance at the man in front of him, his curiosity growing with each passing moment. For Victor, the contrast was jarring. Everything about Keanu's presence seemed to challenge his worldview. The unspoken rules he lived by, rules that said appearances mattered, that success was something you wore on your sleeve for everyone to see. And yet, here was a man who carried none of those markers but seemed completely at ease. Even in the face of Victor's judgment, as they approached the boarding gate, Victor couldn't resist another jab, his tone tinged with amusement. "So, what brings you to first class?" he asked, feigning casual interest. "Lucky upgrade?" Keanu glanced back at him, his expression as steady as before. "No," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just a ticket." Victor chuckled, shaking his head as if Keanu's response had confirmed his assumptions. "Must be nice," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Keanu to hear. Keanu didn't react. He simply adjusted the strap of his backpack and stepped forward to hand his boarding pass to the attendant. Victor followed, his confidence intact but his curiosity now bordering on irritation. When they boarded the plane and Victor realized his seat was right next to Keanu's, he couldn't hide his disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, shaking his head as he slid into his seat. The thought of spending the next several hours beside someone he had so openly dismissed was almost too much to bear. Keanu, on the other hand, seemed entirely unbothered by the arrangement. He placed his backpack neatly under the seat in front of him, his movements unhurried and deliberate, and leaned back with a small smile. "Looks like we're traveling together," he said politely, glancing at Victor before turning his attention to the window. Victor crossed his arms, his discomfort clear. The idea that this quiet, unassuming man could share the same exclusive space as him felt like a personal affront, though he couldn't quite explain why. It wasn't just about appearances, it was something deeper, something unsettling about the way Keanu carried himself with a quiet confidence that needed no validation. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Victor stole another glance at Keanu, his curiosity now mixed with frustration. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye, and the thought both irritated and intrigued him. For Keanu, however, the situation was nothing more than another moment in a life lived without pretense. He wasn't here to prove anything or to compete with anyone. He was simply here, present in the moment, content to let the world make its judgments while he stayed true to himself. Keanu didn't react to Victor's jab. Instead, he responded with a small, polite smile and calmly turned his focus back to the line ahead. There was no sign of annoyance or discomfort, only a quiet resolve, as if he had heard it all before and refused to let it disrupt his peace. Victor, however, wasn't ready to let it go. His curiosity had been piqued, but more than that, his need to establish dominance simmered beneath the surface. He glanced at Keanu again, studying the man as though trying to solve a puzzle. Who was he, really? And why did he seem so unaffected? When boarding began, the line moved forward, and both men handed their tickets to the attendant. As they made their way down the narrow aisle to their seats, Victor glanced at his ticket and froze. His heart sank as his eyes darted between the numbers on the ticket and the seat assignments ahead. His destination was right next to Keanu's. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. Of all the places on the plane, he thought, why here? For a moment, he hesitated, considering whether it was too late to request a change. But the cabin was already filling up, and his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. Keanu, meanwhile, was already settling into his seat. He placed his weathered backpack under the seat in front of him with care, as though it carried something precious. When Victor finally lowered himself into the seat beside him, he let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Of all the places," he said, half joking but mostly annoyed. "It had to be here." Keanu turned to face him, his expression as calm as ever. There was no trace of irritation in his eyes, only an unshakable composure. "Looks like we're traveling together," he replied politely, his tone steady and devoid of malice. Victor crossed his arms, his discomfort impossible to hide. He leaned back in his seat, his sharp suit pristine against the plush first-class chair. But no amount of luxury could erase the unease creeping into his mind. The idea of sharing this exclusive space with someone he had silently deemed unworthy was an affront to his carefully curated sense of superiority. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Victor's thoughts raced. He couldn't reconcile the man beside him with the polished, high-achieving image he associated with first-class passengers. There was something about Keanu's unassuming demeanor that unsettled him, a quiet confidence that seemed immune to judgment. It wasn't just confusing, it was irritating. The plane lifted into the air, and Victor, unable to sit with his discomfort any longer, decided to break the silence. His tone was casual, but his words carried an edge. "So," he began, glancing at Keanu out of the corner of his eye, "what do you do for a living?" Keanu adjusted the strap of his backpack, his movements unhurried. He met Victor's gaze briefly before replying with a simple, "I work in film." Victor raised an eyebrow, his skepticism palpable. "Oh, I see," he said, dragging out the words as though tasting them for the first time. "Commercials? Small-time projects?" Keanu gave a faint smile. the kind that conveyed more patience than agreement. "Something like that," he said, his tone light but deliberate. Victor leaned back, clearly unimpressed. To him, Keanu's vague answer felt like confirmation of his assumptions. He smirked, letting out a small laugh. "Interesting," he said, the sarcasm in his voice impossible to miss. "I guess everyone's got their thing." Keanu didn't respond immediately. Instead, he adjusted his position in his seat, gazing out the window as if to remind himself of the vastness beyond this moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, almost reflective. "We all have our place," he said, "and sometimes it's not about what we do, it's about how we do it." Victor blinked, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected depth of the statement. He wasn't used to this kind of conversation, especially from someone he had so quickly dismissed. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if there was more to this man than he had assumed. But instead of pursuing the thought, he doubled down on his original stance. "That's philosophical," Victor replied, his words tinged with mockery. "But in the real world, you've got to prove yourself. You've got to show people you belong." Keanu turned to him again, his gaze steady but gentle. "Maybe," he said, his voice calm, "but belonging isn't always about what you show others. Sometimes it's about what you carry within yourself." The words hung in the air between them, quiet yet powerful. For a moment, Victor didn't know how to respond. He shifted in his seat, his confidence shaken, though he would never admit it. Around them, a few passengers exchanged glances, subtly tuning in to the conversation that had begun to shift the atmosphere of the cabin. Victor's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He looked at Keanu, studying him again, this time with a hint of curiosity that wasn't entirely dismissive. Who was this man who spoke with such conviction yet carried himself with such humility? Keanu turned back to the window, signaling the end of the exchange. He didn't need to defend himself or prove his worth. His calm presence spoke louder than words ever could. For Victor, however, the conversation lingered. As the plane continued its ascent, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had underestimated the man beside him. And though he didn't know it yet, the journey ahead would challenge not just his assumptions about Keanu, but his understanding of success, humility, and what it truly meant to belong. Victor leaned back in his plush first-class seat, a faint smile playing on his lips. There was an air of superiority in the way he carried himself, a self-assuredness that bordered on arrogance. He swirled his champagne glass slightly before speaking, his tone dripping with condescension. "You know," he said casually, "first class is a space reserved for people who've really made it. It's not just about the seat, it's about what it represents. Some places," he continued, pausing for effect, "just aren't meant for everyone." Keanu, seated beside him, turned his head slightly. His expression was calm, his eyes steady as he met Victor's gaze. There was no anger or defensiveness in his demeanor, only thoughtfulness. After a brief moment, he replied, his voice low and even. "I think we all have our place," he said, "and sometimes it's exactly where we are." The simplicity of Keanu's words hung in the air, cutting through the hum of the airplane cabin. For a moment, Victor hesitated. Something about the response caught him off guard. He hadn't expected this quiet man to counter his jab with such grace. Unsure how to react, Victor dismissed the comment with a quick wave of his hand and a scoff. "Philosophical, huh?" he said, leaning forward slightly. "But the real world doesn't work that way." Keanu didn't argue. Instead, he turned his gaze to the window, watching as clouds passed by in the expanse of blue beyond. His demeanor suggested that the conversation was over, at least for him. But for Victor, it was far from finished. The calmness Keanu exuded wasn't just unsettling, it was infuriating. It was as if nothing Victor said could shake him, and that only fueled Victor's desire to provoke further. Victor took a sip of champagne, the corners of his mouth curling into a faint smirk. He turned back to Keanu, his voice laced with thinly veiled mockery. "You know," he began, gesturing with his glass, "life is a lot like flying first class. You work hard, you earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people," he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, Some people are just here because of luck. Keanu turned away from the window, his movements slow and deliberate, as though giving Victor's words the weight of consideration. His expression remained unchanged, calm, composed, but there was a subtle shift in his tone when he spoke. It was firmer now, though not confrontational. Luck or hard work, Keanu said, meeting Victor's gaze evenly. We all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we? Victor let out a short laugh, but it lacked the confidence he intended. The response had struck a nerve, though he wouldn't admit it. He leaned back in his seat, trying to regain his composure. That's a nice sentiment, he said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. But some of us are on a higher level. Not everyone understands the value of being here. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. He remained silent for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Around them, a few passengers who had been subtly listening to the exchange began to take more notice. The dynamic between the two men was drawing attention, not because of raised voices or dramatic gestures, but because of the quiet tension that underscored every word. Finally, Keanu spoke, his voice steady but carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. The value of being here, he said, gesturing around the first-class cabin, isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat others. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward. For a moment, Victor was speechless. He glanced around, noticing that some of the nearby passengers were nodding subtly, their expressions thoughtful. The balance of the conversation had shifted, and Victor could feel it. Still, his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He straightened in his seat, a forced smile on his face. That's poetic, he said, though his tone lacked the sharpness it had carried earlier. But in the real world, it's not that simple. If you don't prove yourself, if you don't show what you've achieved, people will walk all over you. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression softening. There was no trace of irritation or impatience in his demeanor, only an unshakable calm. Maybe, he said quietly, but I've found that when people focus too much on proving themselves to others, it's often because they're trying to fill something missing inside. Victor's smirk faltered, and for the first time, he didn't have an immediate comeback. He shifted in his seat, his hand tightening slightly around the stem of his champagne glass. The words had struck deeper than he cared to admit. I'm not saying that's you, Keanu added gently, his tone carrying a note of understanding. But I've met a lot of people who thought success was about what others could see. And deep down, they were just trying to find something they'd lost. Victor opened his mouth as if to respond but stopped short. For a moment, he fiddled with his cufflinks, his eyes avoiding Keanu's. The plane hummed softly around them, the sound of its engines filling the silence. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from admiration for Keanu to quiet disapproval for Victor. Finally, Victor cleared his throat. Look, he said, his voice quieter now, almost subdued. I didn't mean to offend you. He hesitated, searching for the right words. I didn't realize who you were. Keanu raised an eyebrow, his expression curious but kind. Who I am doesn't matter, he said simply. What matters is how we treat people, no matter who they are. Victor fell silent, the weight of Keanu's words settling over him like a blanket. He glanced at his glass, at his hands, at the seat in front of him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been exposed, not by Keanu, but by himself. The plane continued its journey, the clouds outside shifting from white to gold as the sun began to set. Keanu turned back to the window, his posture relaxed, as if the conversation had left him untouched. But for Victor, it was clear that something had shifted. His confidence had been shaken, his worldview subtly but undeniably challenged. And though he didn't know it yet, the lesson Keanu had imparted would stay with him long after the flight had landed. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his gaze calm but penetrating, holding Victor's eyes with an unshakable steadiness. I think the value of being here isn't about what you have, he said softly, his voice steady and deliberate, but about how you treat others. The words seemed to slice through the air, cutting straight to the heart of the conversation. Their simplicity carried an undeniable weight that settled heavily between them. Passengers seated nearby, who had been stealing subtle glances, began exchanging looks of quiet approval. A few nodded, their expressions thoughtful, while others cast disapproving glances at Victor, as if silently judging his earlier remarks. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident posture now slightly slouched. He crossed his arms defensively, his lips tightening. "That's easy for you to say," he shot back, his tone sharper now, tinged with irritation. "You don't know what it's like to compete in the real world." Keanu leaned back into his seat, his movements unhurried, as though Victor's words hadn't unsettled him in the slightest. "Maybe not," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "But I've learned that true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself." The hum of the airplane engines seemed to amplify the growing stillness in the cabin. Keanu's words hung there, resonating like an unspoken truth. Victor opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. The quiet confidence in Keanu's voice made it hard to argue. Victor, however, wasn't ready to concede. He straightened in his seat, forcing a scoff. "Cheap philosophy," he muttered, the edge in his voice betraying his frustration. "In the real world, if you don't prove yourself, people will walk all over you. You have to show them you're not to be underestimated." Keanu didn't flinch. His calm demeanor remained steady, unyielding in the face of Victor's growing agitation. He tilted his head slightly, considering his next words carefully. "Maybe," he said evenly, "but I've also noticed something. When people focus too much on proving themselves to others, it's often because they're trying to fill something missing inside." Victor froze, the statement landing with more force than he expected. His confident facade flickered, a momentary crack appearing in the armor he wore so tightly. He shifted in his seat, his fingers absent-mindedly fiddling with the wedding band on his finger, a small but telling gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Keanu. The passengers around them exchanged quiet glances, sensing the shift in the dynamic. Victor, clearly caught off guard, let out a short, nervous laugh. "That's not me," he said quickly, his voice faltering slightly. "Everything I have, I worked for. I earned my place." Keanu nodded thoughtfully, his expression softening but remaining resolute. He wasn't trying to antagonize Victor, but there was a quiet wisdom in his eyes that seemed to speak directly to the man's inner conflict. "I'm not saying you didn't work hard," Keanu said gently, "but sometimes, in chasing success, we lose sight of what really matters." Victor's jaw tightened, his eyes darted to the seat back in front of him, avoiding Keanu's gaze. The words lingered in his mind, gnawing at the carefully constructed image he had built of himself. For the first time, he found himself questioning whether that image was more of a mask than a reflection of who he truly was. The cabin remained unusually quiet, as though the entire first-class section was holding its breath. A subtle tension had settled over the space, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that made people reflect, the kind that forced them to think. Victor's hand stilled on his wedding band, his thoughts momentarily betraying him. Had he spent so much time proving his worth to the world that he had forgotten to consider his own happiness? The question lingered in his mind like a shadow, and for a moment, he hated the calm, unbothered man sitting beside him for bringing it to light. But Keanu didn't press further. He turned his attention back to the window, letting the conversation settle without adding to it. His movements were deliberate, his presence unshakable. It wasn't a retreat, it was a quiet act of grace, giving Victor the space to process what had been said. Victor let out a slow breath, his mind racing with thoughts he didn't want to confront. He glanced around the cabin, noticing for the first time that several passengers were watching him. Their faces carried a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. And for the first time in a long while, Victor felt small. Keanu's words echoed in his mind, their simplicity belying their depth. When people focus too much on proving themselves, it's often because they're trying to fill something missing inside. The sentence repeated itself like a refrain, growing louder with each repetition. Victor wanted to brush it off, to dismiss it as pretentious nonsense. But deep down, he knew there was truth in it, a truth he wasn't ready to admit. He forced another chuckle, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Well," he said, his voice quieter now, "I guess not everyone sees the world the same way." Keanu glanced at him, offering a small, kind smile. That's what makes it interesting, don't you think? Victor didn't respond. He simply nodded, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him in a way he couldn't ignore. For the rest of the flight, he sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the untouched champagne glass in front of him. His earlier bravado had been replaced by something quieter, something closer to self-reflection. Keanu, meanwhile, remained as calm and composed as ever. He didn't need to say anything more. His presence alone spoke volumes. As he leaned back in his seat, the sunlight streaming through the window illuminated his face, highlighting the quiet strength that seemed to define him. By the time the plane began its descent, Victor's thoughts were a tangled web of pride, shame, and reluctant acknowledgement. Keanu's words had planted a seed, a small but undeniable shift in perspective. And though Victor didn't know it yet, the encounter would linger in his mind long after they parted ways, serving as a quiet reminder of the things that truly mattered. Keanu nodded, his gaze steady and kind. "I'm not saying you didn't work hard," he said, his voice low but deliberate. "But sometimes, what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves." The weight of his words seemed to settle over the entire cabin. The hum of the airplane engines faded into the background as a profound silence took hold. Passengers, who had been subtly observing the exchange, now openly exchanged glances. Some nodded knowingly, as if Keanu's words had struck a chord within them too. Victor, however, was no longer the confident man who had walked onto the plane with an air of superiority. His earlier arrogance had melted away, replaced by a quiet vulnerability. He stared down at his hands, fidgeting with his wedding band, as though searching for an anchor in the storm of his thoughts. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself, of his assumptions, and perhaps of the image he had spent years projecting to the world. Moments later, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the stillness. The flight attendant leaned down toward Keanu with a polite smile. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her tone professional yet warm. "The captain asked me to let you know your connection in Tokyo has been confirmed." The name Reeves rippled through the cabin like a sudden gust of wind. A murmur spread among the passengers as recognition lit up their faces. Quiet whispers and discreet glances replaced the earlier silence. Victor froze, his mind racing as he pieced it together. His face paled as he turned toward Keanu, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. "Keanu Reeves," he murmured, almost to himself. Keanu met his gaze with the same calm, unshakable demeanor he had maintained throughout the flight. He nodded politely, his expression unchanged. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice as steady as ever. Victor stammered, struggling to find his footing in this unexpected revelation. The man he had judged, dismissed, and tried to provoke was not only someone of immense fame, but someone who carried himself with a humility that Victor couldn't begin to fathom. I didn't realize," he began, his voice faltering. Keanu's response was calm but firm, each word carrying a quiet authority. "Victor," he said, "what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to, it depends on how you choose to treat people." Victor's face flushed with shame, the weight of Keanu's words settling deep in his chest. The passengers around them, many of whom had recognized Keanu by now, exchanged approving glances, their expressions a mixture of respect for Keanu and quiet disapproval of Victor's earlier behavior. Victor leaned back in his seat, his once confident posture now deflated. For the rest of the flight, he sat in silence, replaying the conversation over and over in his mind. Each of Keanu's words echoed with a clarity that refused to be ignored. The man he had underestimated had taught him a lesson, not through anger or condescension, but through calmness, wisdom, and a quiet strength that spoke louder than words ever could. As the plane began its descent, Victor stole a glance at Keanu, who sat with an air of peacefulness, gazing out the window at the soft hues of the setting sun. The calm on Keanu's face was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Victor. He felt exposed, as though the walls he had built around himself were crumbling, leaving him vulnerable for the first time in years. When the plane landed and passengers began gathering their belongings, Victor hesitated. His pride urged him to leave quickly, to avoid further humiliation. But something deeper, a faint flicker of conscience, compelled him to stay. Summoning his courage, he turned to Keanu, his voice quieter, almost apologetic. "I acted like an idiot," he admitted, the words heavy but genuine. "I'm sorry." Keanu looked at him, his expression softening. He offered a faint smile, one that carried no trace of resentment or superiority, only understanding. "I appreciate the apology," he said gently, "but I hope you learn from this. Life is hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is to tear each other down." Victor nodded, his throat tight as he processed Keanu's words. They weren't just a response to his behavior, they were an invitation to reflect, to grow, and perhaps to change. He watched as Keanu stood, retrieving his weathered backpack from under the seat. There was no fanfare, no need for attention. Even in the crowded terminal, Keanu moved with the same quiet grace that had defined him throughout the flight. As Victor gathered his own belongings, he couldn't help but pause and watch as Keanu disappeared into the bustling crowd of travelers. Fans approached him, their faces lighting up with recognition. Keanu greeted each of them with genuine warmth, his humility shining through in every interaction. There was no rush, no impatience, only a quiet appreciation for the moment and the people in it. Victor stood still, clutching his bag, as a wave of realization washed over him. True success, he thought, wasn't about the status you flaunted or the things you owned. It was about character, about how you treated others when no one was watching and when everyone was. Keanu had shown him that in the simplest, most profound way possible. As Victor walked toward the terminal exit, he resolved to carry the lesson forward. He couldn't undo his behavior, but he could change what came next. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. Hope that he could be better, not for the world's approval, but for his own peace of mind. Keanu's words lingered in his thoughts long after the encounter had ended. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to, it depends on how you treat people. And in that moment, Victor understood that the hardest journeys weren't the ones we took to climb higher, but the ones that led us back to ourselves.